Hello, welcome to the first of two videos looking at both the positives and negative views of Henry VII's domestic policy, whilst he's on the throne between 1485 and 1509. These are a collection of thoughts and they are backed by evidence, although it is for you to consider and find what specific evidence could be used to back each point made as part of your revision process. So, let's start. I'm going to work my way through them. They'll be loosely connected and they're really to get you thinking about where you stand on Henry VII's domestic policy and, crucially, what evidence you can bring to either support or challenge the points of view that I'm going to be putting forward. Let's look at the first one here. The case of the nobles. Now, the nobles are commonly highlighted as a great triumph of Henry VII in the way that he dealt with this spectre of the overmighty noble. But the truth is a little bit different. In fact, the nobles themselves, based on their geographic proximity to those who were subjects of Henry VII, meant that they still controlled their areas. All that Henry VII's policy actually achieved was to provide the nobles with reasons to be suspicious of the king and even go so far as potentially to consider disloyalty to him. And this becomes especially problematic toward the end of Henry VII's reign, when historians have speculated over whether he would have lasted much longer without facing a considerable uprising from amongst the nobles. What's more, the much lauded hostility towards the nobles that Henry VII operates is entirely unnecessary, after, as historians such as Christine Carpenter have mentioned, in effect, because of the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses, what nobles wanted most of all was to have a settled, stable crown. They wanted Henry VII to succeed. Henry VII was, in a way, a kind of compromise candidate, a unifying figure who was to rise above the issues of Lancaster versus York, and the nobles were fully behind this. All Henry really does in his vengeful approach to the nobles is to distance himself from those who could and should have been his greatest allies. In effect, one of the issues and one of the problems which characterises Henry VII's entire rule in all areas is his paranoia. Now, rightly or wrongly, he believed that he was always facing threats, even when in reality those threats were minor. Take, for example, the infamous now treason plot of Stanley. Now, the Stanley plot is something of a turning point in how Henry VII operates as king. He responds, for example, with setting up the Privy Chamber. He goes into himself, and in effect, he acts as a limited elite ruling over the rest of the country. A bit like what today we describe as an autocratic regime. Now, in fact, you could turn and consider that this response to Stanley was an overreaction. If anything, the fact that Stanley's plotting and involvement in the Warbeck plot shows that Henry VII's methods are working. The spy network he has in place works. The checks and balances he has to ensure that nobody can get too close without being fully vetted works. It is not in any way, nor should it be seen by Henry VII as evidence that he needs to retreat into himself and offer more self-serving domestic policies in the vain effort of preventing potential intrigues against him from amongst the nobility. There just isn't the case for this. In fact, what Henry goes on to do with, for example, his policies against retaining, is he is operating out of fear, and a pervasive fear and a pervasive terror and mistrust of those very same people who he could have had as valued allies in his efforts to stabilise the country. Now again, one of the often lauded aspects of what Henry VII does is in raising up the gentry. He looks to move beyond the nobles in an effort to bypass the nobles and reduce their power. He turns to the gentry and his men, those who will serve him and be obedient to him. Now, this has obvious benefits, of which some we'll discuss in the second video, but there are definitely negatives. For example, his empowering of justice of the peace actually means that he's ignoring the potential expertise of experienced nobles who know better than anybody how to operate and how to keep the peace in their particular regions. He's falsely elevated a group who are not capable and are not experienced administrators. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that there are tales of justice of the peace and others in the gentry single-handedly failing to carry out their duties successfully. What's more, this empowering and raising up of a new class, the gentry, can be seen as causing trouble for those who followed him as king, his son and his grandchildren, who have to battle with just these types of people who, having been given a false sense of importance, feel that their say and their factions need to be listened to in the rule of England. In short, by awarding positions based on loyalty and patronage rather than capacity to do the job effectively, Henry is putting his own paranoia above the best interests of the realm. Now, it can be said, and it has been said, that Henry VII is the last medieval ruler, and definitely I think it's fair to say that even compared to the likes of Edward IV, Henry's approach was a regression to personal rule. He completely misses the opportunity to professionalise and modernise the government. It's only, at least according to Elton, it's only when Cromwell comes in and his work as administrator in the 1530s that the revolution in Tudor government takes place. It's no surprise then that really, when we reflect on it, Henry VII is anything but an innovator. In fact, his cheerleaders, and certainly those of the people like Scarisbrick from the 1970s, have raised him up to suggest that actually Henry was a brilliant administrator and took great personal interest in the administration. Well, the more we find out about it, the more we question this. In fact, rather than his direct involvement, we can actually assume that it's the work of brilliant administrators in Morton, Bray and Empson who carry out the levels of effective administration that Henry VII has been given credit for, an undue credit. Because Henry VII was far more reliant on skilled administrators than is commonly suggested by many historians. Finally, we come to the issue of Henry the Miser and Henry the Hoarder. Henry's greed became infamous and negatively affected the status of the crown. The way that he knowingly allowed the likes of Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson. Empson and Dudley are allowed to carry on in a way which in modern terms we would describe as criminal. Many of those who are punished by Empson and Dudley are done so for things that they are not guilty of. Similarly, the actions of the council learned in law and the moves over feudal Jew revenues, in many cases we can say that this is Henry looking to squeeze every last drop out of people who, in many cases, simply did not deserve to be treated that way, especially when we consider his attempts to profit from wardships. He has no right and he has no business really in being involved in this, yet off he goes. And what does he use the money for? He creates a supposedly vast amount of money that he gets praised for. But when we look at the money that he was left with, when we look at the surplus, despite the fact that quality of life for people under his reign is not significantly improved, we can consider that surplus to be relatively small, certainly well short of the 1.8 million that was claimed by his 17th century propaganda merchants. Far from it. We're talking more like 300,000, which is not a small sum, but it really is a sum which was designed selfishly by Henry to protect him in the case of an uprising. It definitely isn't enough to turn away an invasion from a foreign power. And let's not forget the fact that this vast sum that Henry gets lorded over for the amount of wealth he brought to the crown, is frittered away very quickly, and to be honest, in not a particularly, compared to some of his later opulence, in a particularly sort of over-the-top spending from Henry VIII. The fact is, it just isn't that much money. Buying into this, the idea that Henry VII is running a fantastically clever administration can be challenged by the fact that almost as soon as he has died, the new council who he has set up to advise his son Henry VIII, they are the ones who are advising the arrest and later execution of Empson and Dudley. They are aware, those advisors that he supposedly trusts, they know that his policy, particularly his domestic policy, is flawed. In fact, many historians have questioned, as I mentioned before, whether, had he not died at the relatively tender age of 52, Henry VII would have faced a threat and a challenge to his authority based on his seemingly open mistreatment of those who were key members of society. I'll leave the final word in the indictment of Henry VII to a brilliant historian, Christine Carpenter, who summarises her views on Henry VII thus: a ruler of very modest ability, who failed to understand the needs of the nation over which he had control. Henry VII was lucky. In many ways, Henry VII's policies did not contribute to the stability of his position as king. Ultimately, in many ways, they detracted from it, but he got lucky.